My wife and I have been married for almost 15 years, and for most of that time, things were steady and predictable. But recently, something in her behavior changed, and not in a way that made sense. She started acting differently, staying out later during her late-night shifts, and paying far more attention to her appearance than she ever had before. She began wearing makeup to work, something she never bothered with before, and would spritz on a ton of perfume. Her overall grooming suddenly became a priority. Now, that might seem normal for some, but my wife works as an engineer at a factory, a place where her looks didn't matter at all. On top of that, she works in a two-shift system. One week she's on the 7 a.m. shift, the next week the 2 p.m. shift. From the day her appearance changed, I noticed something else. When she worked the afternoon shift, she stopped coming home at her usual time. It wasn't just that. I discovered she had taken so many unplanned days off that she couldn't take our usual 3-week summer vacation, a tradition for us every year we've been together. She didn't mention why, and I didn't ask. Instead, I decided to investigate on my own. It didn't take long to figure out what was going on. I parked my car near her workplace, in the lot where all her colleagues from the same division parked. That's when I overheard everything. Some of her coworkers were talking, and it didn't take long for me to pick up on the gossip. My wife was flirting heavily with the new manager, and it was starting to annoy everyone. Apparently, their chemistry was so blatant it was impossible to ignore. What surprised me was that they even talked about me in an oddly sympathetic way. Because I had attended the company's annual barbecue with her in the past, many of her colleagues knew me. They liked me, even joked about me having a few screws loose, a remark that came from my background. I'm a veteran, medically retired after serving in a high-impact intervention unit, essentially a special forces division that specialized in precision eliminations of high-value targets. Killing without a trace was just another part of the job during missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. I won't sugarcoat it. My work left me with PTSD, and my life now runs on a disability income provided by the Ministry of Defense. Hearing her co-workers say things like, "If he finds out, he'll kill them both without leaving a trace," didn't shock me. What surprised me more was their tone. They genuinely seemed concerned for me and appalled at my wife's behavior. Some even said the two of them deserved whatever fallout was coming their way. I stayed put until I saw the two of them leave the factory together. The manager locked the door, and without hesitation, grabbed my wife and kissed her passionately. It wasn't subtle. It was like they didn't have a care in the world. After that, they got into his car and drove off. I followed them. 7 minutes later, they pulled into a quiet street on the other side of town and went into a house. I stayed outside, watching. The light came on in one of the upstairs bedrooms almost immediately, and I didn't need to guess what was happening in there. After waiting a few minutes, I got out of my car and approached the house. In just a few seconds, I quietly unlocked the front door and slipped inside, switching my phone to silent and airplane mode. Everything felt oddly familiar, like being back on a mission. I moved soundlessly, just as I had back then. I didn't have to look far. My wife's laughter and moans were coming from upstairs. I followed the sound, climbing the steps without making a noise. There were 3 doors on the first floor, 2 closed and 1 slightly ajar. Through the crack, I saw everything I expected. For a moment, I just stood there and watched. My wife was in bed with her manager, and they were going at it like teenagers. Moaning, dirty talk, the whole thing. I took out my phone, made sure it was on silent, and started recording. At first, I wasn't even angry. I wasn't shocked either. Over the years, my wife and I had been to swinger clubs and sex parties. Watching her with other men wasn't exactly new for me. But then he said something that pushed me over the edge. "Is your husband as good in bed as I am?" he asked, clearly trying to stroke his own ego. At first, my wife didn't answer, telling him to drop it. But he kept pressing, as if he couldn't help himself. "Come on, if you were any good, you wouldn't be here with me right now," he added smugly. That's when she made the mistake that turned everything inside me cold. She started talking about me, disrespectfully. She lied, and not just about me as a husband, but as a man. That's when my anger hit its boiling point. Not because of what I saw. After all, we had spent years visiting swinger clubs and attending sex parties, but because of what I heard. He wasn't as good as I was in bed, not by a long shot, and I could tell. Watching his movements, it was clear he was clumsy and far from thorough. Based on what I saw, I'd bet good money his tool was maybe a third of mine in size. Half at best. Watching him, I swear it looked like she was getting screwed by a kid. What stood out to me most was her demeanor. My wife wasn't turned on. Her body language screamed indifference like she was just there. After about 15 minutes, she faked an orgasm. I know she faked it, and apparently it was enough to trigger him into finishing too. Then, as if he couldn't be any more ridiculous, he climbed off the bed and told her not to move, to wait for him while he went to take a leak, so they could start round 2 of what I could only describe as small dick sex. I moved quickly, hiding in another room, just before he came back upstairs. While they resumed whatever pathetic excuse for passion they were having, I went downstairs. I decided I'd help myself to a little compensation for the betrayal. A quick scan of the living room led me to a $25,000 Breitling watch lying on the table near the couch. Jackpot! I opened a nearby cabinet and found a stash of cash, quite a bit of it. It felt like the universe was handing me a consolation prize. Hiring an escort would have been a hell of a lot cheaper, buddy, I thought as I pocketed the watch and the cash. By the time I left, I estimated the total cost of his little affair with my wife to be about $29,000. With that, she officially became the most expensive mistress in America. I got in my car, drove back to the factory where her car was still parked, and used the spare key I'd brought with me to move it. It only took me a few minutes, and just like that, her car was gone. I figured it was going to be a nice surprise for her to discover when she got back. After that, I drove to our favorite bar near home. I ordered a shot of liquor and a beer, trying to calm down while knowing she wouldn't be home for at least another hour. As I sat there, I started noticing my surroundings and spotted one of her co-workers, someone I recognized from the company barbecue. He was playing pool with a woman I assumed was his new girlfriend. Eventually, I struck up a conversation with him. After some small talk, I asked if we could step outside for a moment to chat privately. He agreed, saying he wanted to smoke anyway and even offered me one. I don't smoke, but at that moment it didn't matter. I took the cigarette, lit it, and stood there with him, both of us looking out into the quiet night. "You know who I am, right?" I asked. "We've met before." "Of course," he said. "You're Emily's husband. You're the former Special Forces guy, right? We had a great time at the barbecue the year before last." "I couldn't make it last year, though." I nodded. "That's right," I said, locking eyes with him. "Listen, can I confide in you about something?" He looked at me with genuine interest and concern. "Sure. You can trust me. I won't say a word to anyone if you don't want me to." I paused for a second before continuing. "I want to talk about the new manager at your factory. Do you know him?" "Yeah," he replied. "He's my manager, too." "What's going on?" I chuckled dryly. "I think you already know. Tonight, I parked near the factory, and when your colleagues from the late shift were leaving, I heard what they were saying about my wife and the manager." His face turned serious. "I'm on the other team, so I don't see much, but I've heard the rumors." "Well," I said, grinning slightly, "I'm here to tell you the rumors are true. Ever since that guy started working there, my wife has been acting off. She suddenly started wearing makeup and perfume to work, which she's never done before. And on weeks when she works the late shift, she stays out way later than she ever used to, telling me she's working extra hours to help train the new guy." He listened closely, nodding as I went on. "I wanted to plan a surprise weekend trip for the two of us to Barcelona," I continued. "I've done that a few times every year, so I contacted HR to ask when she could take a couple of days off. That's when HR told me she'd already burned through so much time off that she wouldn't even have enough vacation days for our usual summer break. They also told me there was no extra work for her to do. So those extra hours she's been putting in, they didn't exist." He frowned. "That's odd." "Yeah, it is," I said, shaking my head. "So I decided to check it out for myself tonight." I parked at the factory, heard the rumors from her colleagues, and then watched as she left with the manager. They kissed right there in the parking lot, got into his car, and drove off to what I'm assuming is his house. And when I followed them inside, I saw for myself what they were up to. Let's just say it wasn't something a married woman should be doing, or something a manager should be doing with his subordinate. I smiled at my wife's colleague as he looked at me curiously. "Did you catch them?" he asked quietly. "No," I said with a calm grin. "I filmed them with my phone, but they didn't see me. And now I need your help." I kept my eyes on him as I pulled out the stack of cash I'd found earlier, thousands of dollars stuffed into my back pocket. I started counting off $4,000 right in front of him. "Here's the deal," I said, holding out the money. "This $4,000 is yours if you go to the manager's office tomorrow at exactly 11 a.m. All I need you to do is ask him one simple question. Does he know who Emily's husband is, what I did for work, and isn't he worried about what might happen if I find out he's screwing my wife?" I leaned in slightly, keeping my tone casual. "Of course he'll deny it. That's when you pull out your phone and tell him my specialty is making people disappear without a trace, or letting them live long enough to regret it. Then you show him the video I recorded tonight. As soon as he sees it, you end the conversation and walk out. Simple as that. After you're done, delete the video. No sharing, no copies. Just show him and erase it. You'll have earned every dollar of this." I paused for effect, my voice still calm but firm. "And I don't need to tell you what happens if you try to screw me over, right? So, what do you think? Can you do it? Because while you're handling that, I'll be sending HR a nice little message about their golden boy violating company policy by sleeping with his subordinate. He'll lose his job, and I'll make sure he leaves town altogether, never to speak to my soon-to-be ex-wife again." His response was immediate and unwavering. "I'll help you, no question about it. You don't deserve this." Honestly, getting fired and scared off is the least of what he deserves. If he did this to my wife and I had your skills, I'd probably kill him myself. You can trust me. I won't let you down. Satisfied, I handed him the $4,000 and sent the video to his phone. We shook hands, and I offered to buy him another beer. Just then, the manager's car rolled by, with my wife sitting in the passenger seat. I whistled sharply with my fingers, and the car came to a stop before reversing back toward us. I nodded her colleague to head back inside the bar while I stayed put. My wife stepped out first, followed closely by the manager, who had the nerve to walk toward me like he owned the place. "Where's your car?" I asked her, playing dumb. She sighed, clearly flustered. "I think it's stolen." The manager extended his hand to introduce himself, but I ignored it, staying composed, something that's second nature to me. He didn't suspect a thing. I turned to leave, but my wife, oblivious to the tension in the air, asked if he'd join us for a drink. I shut it down immediately. "No, work's over. I want to spend the rest of the night alone with my wife." She looked confused, probably because that's not something I'd usually say, especially not to her boss. I'm not the type to isolate myself. I like people, but this time, I wanted to make sure she picked up on the shift. The manager said his goodbyes and got back in his car. As soon as he pulled away, I grabbed her arm, firmly but not aggressively. She pulled back, hissing, "What the hell?" I pushed her gently against the wall, my voice low and steady. "Don't," I said simply, the weight of that single word hitting her harder than any shouting ever could. It worked. She immediately apologized, her tone shaky, and followed me back into the bar. She sat quietly next to me, sipping a glass of white wine. I ignored her, giving away a couple of rounds of drinks to people nearby, while I sat silently. After a while, she finally worked up the nerve to ask, "Is everything okay?" My response was short and cold. "No." That shut her up completely. She sat there nervously, probably assuming I was dealing with a PTSD-related issue. I let her believe that. Letting her think it was something unrelated to her was better for now. She'd find out the truth soon enough. We drank for another half hour before I told her we were heading home. At home, I kept up the act, short, irritated responses, refusing to talk about what was bothering me. She didn't push. Instead, she went straight upstairs to take a shower and then to bed, avoiding any further confrontation. I stayed downstairs, flipping through TV channels and playing games on my phone, something oddly relaxing for me. The next morning, she came downstairs and froze slightly when she saw me sitting exactly where I'd been the night before. I could tell she was nervous. She knew our agreement. Whenever something was bothering me, it was her responsibility to talk to me about it, as part of the coping process I'd worked out with my trauma psychologist. But she didn't want to. I could see it in her face. She hoped, more than anything, that whatever was bothering me had nothing to do with her. Deep down, though, I think she knew. She remembered my ability to sense things, how I could pick up on problems based on gut feelings alone, even when I had no hard evidence. That skill both fascinated and scared her. This time, though, she wasn't getting away with it. At that moment, she knew exactly what she was doing wrong. She was fully aware that her affair with her boss was a direct violation of the agreement we made when we decided to open up our marriage. Honesty and transparency were non-negotiable. We had agreed that any outside encounters would only happen if shared openly with each other. She knew I would see her deception as a betrayal, especially given my background as a former Special Forces soldier. Loyalty was drilled into me during my training. It was sacred, something you never broke. In the Army, we operated as a team. You went on a mission together, and you came home together, no matter what. Hundreds of times, I had told her that I considered us a team, just like my brothers in arms, and loyalty between us was just as crucial. The trauma specialists who treated me made this crystal clear to her. They told her, point blank, never to lie to me or break a promise. If she couldn't uphold her word, she was to tell me why, honestly. They warned her that any betrayal could trigger my rage, causing me to lash out aggressively. And now, here she was, refusing to talk to me that morning, an act of silence that said more than words ever could. So I picked a fight. Why haven't you filed a police report for your missing car yet? She tried to deflect, saying she forgot because I'd been so on edge the night before. I called her out on it. That's not true, and you know it. If it were, we'd be talking about what's bothering me right now, just like we agreed with my trauma psychologist. You've done this before, at least 40 times in the last 15 years. You let me cool off for a few hours, then come to me and start the conversation. You know that's how we're supposed to handle things. But this time, you walked into the living room just now and chose silence. You knew I'd calm down, didn't you? You know you should be talking to me right now about last night. But you're too scared to say anything because you know you're betraying me. I looked her square in the eyes. And let me tell you something. I'm going to find out today exactly what's going on. You can take that to the bank. That's when she panicked. She couldn't face me. With hours to go before her shift started, she fled to her parents' house around the corner. 20 minutes later, her father walked into our place. It had become a routine over the years. Whenever Emily ran to her parents because I was off balance, her dad showed up to calm things down. "How's it going, son?" he asked, his voice steady. "Not good, Dad." "She really did it this time," I replied. Then I told him everything that had happened over the past few months, the late nights, the makeup, the lies, and what I discovered the night before. "So," he said after I finished, "you agreed to open the marriage on one condition, that she be honest about any sexual encounters. And she broke that promise." "Exactly," I said, nodding. It wasn't much to ask, but apparently it was too much for her. My father-in-law's expression shifted as he looked into my eyes. He knew what was coming. "And how are you going to handle it?" he asked. "I'm going to HR at the factory to report her manager for alienation of affection," I said matter-of-factly. "After that, I'm going to pay him a visit at his house to make it clear that he's leaving town, no exceptions. And he's never going to contact Emily again." "And if he doesn't?" my father-in-law asked, though he already knew the answer. "Well, then I'll have given him more than enough opportunities to walk away unharmed. If he doesn't take them, I'll just treat it like another day at work and finish the job thoroughly." He said nothing, but his face showed he understood exactly what I meant. At 10:50 a.m., my phone rang. It was Emily's colleague, letting me know he was about to walk into the manager's office. I grabbed my coat, my car keys, and the paperwork I needed to sell my wife's car. I was ready. Emily was still with her parents, and I knew she wouldn't be back until shortly before her shift started around 1:30 p.m. That gave me all the time I needed. My first stop, HR. I parked near the office building of the factory and walked straight to reception. "I need to speak with the HR manager," I said firmly. "It's an emergency." "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked. "No, and I'm not leaving until I speak with someone." She hesitated, clearly flustered, and picked up the phone. I leaned against the counter, watching her make the call. I wanted her to feel the tension. Let them feel the urgency of the situation. It was the exact environment I knew how to control. 3 minutes later, a man in his early 40s approached and introduced himself. "Kevin B., head of HR." I nodded, already expecting him. "Good. I'm here because you have a claim hanging over your head." One of your division managers is involved in highly inappropriate behavior with my wife, one of his subordinates. I have the evidence, and I'm formally requesting you take immediate action. If you don't, I'll be suing the company for alienation of affection and seeking substantial damages, including legal fees." Jennings' face tightened, and without another word, he ushered me into a nearby office and motioned for me to sit down. I sat calmly, ready to deliver the final blow. After a 10-minute conversation, the HR manager finally saw things my way and agreed to watch the video I'd recorded. When it ended, he exhaled and smirked slightly. "Well," he said, trying to lighten the mood with some misplaced humor, "if that was the best sex ever, maybe it'd be easier to understand why she'd stray. But this ain't it, is it? There's always one person who tries to joke their way through a tense situation." He promised swift action, confirming that the manager would be terminated as soon as possible. I didn't argue, and, as expected, about an hour later, they sent my wife home while the investigation unfolded. Exactly the amount of time I needed to sell her car. I'd already planned ahead, and within 45 minutes, I sold her $32,000 car for $24,000 cash. Not a great deal, but cash in hand was worth the loss. At that point, my phone rang. It was her. "Can you pick me up?" she asked quietly. "They sent me home. I'm under investigation." I agreed, telling her I'd be there in a few minutes. When I pulled up at the factory, she was already waiting outside, staring at the ground. I stepped out of the car and greeted her with a flat, she wouldn't look me in the eye. "What the hell are they investigating?" I asked, my irritation obvious. She stayed silent, but I wasn't letting it slide. I kept pressing her, repeating the question until her fear cracked through. "You better come clean," I warned, my voice low and serious. "Because if you don't, I can't promise something irreversible won't happen." That finally got her talking. "Relations," she admitted, her voice trembling. "They're investigating inappropriate relations at work between me and the new manager." She barely whispered it, avoiding my gaze completely. I didn't let up. "Well, you're innocent, aren't you? Because if you had sexual relations with your manager, you would have told me, right? That's our agreement. Or, did I miss something?" She shook her head, denying it as tears began welling up in her eyes. "That's what I thought," I said. "So explain to me, how can they be investigating something that doesn't exist?" She shivered, breaking down. Because someone filmed us at his place and showed the video to HR." She sobbed quietly, and I just shook my head. Calmly, I pulled out my phone, hit play, and held it up to her face. "This, Miss Strumpet, is what we call high treason. Breaking the team's trust. Betrayal instead of loyalty." She nodded silently, agreeing with me this time. "So," I continued, my voice cold, "you're lucky you're still breathing, aren't you? And what about that baby dick manager? Does he know whose wife he's been screwing?" "No," she whispered, barely audible. "What? Speak up. I can't hear you." "No," she repeated, louder this time. "He doesn't know?" I tilted my head, pretending to look surprised. "Oh, really? He doesn't know? And you thought that was a good idea?" She nodded again, tears streaming down her face. I wasn't thinking this time." "You can say that again," I muttered. "Now, I had just one question, why?" She couldn't answer. The tears kept falling, but no words came. I waited for a few minutes, watching her crumble. Then I stood up and grabbed my coat. "I'll be back in a few hours. You better be gone by then, or I'll help you pack. And trust me, you don't want that." She tried to speak, but I stopped her with a sharp, "Don't. Just don't. Don't make me lose what little respect I still have for you. That would be healthier for both of us." With that, I walked out, slamming the door behind me. I drove calmly toward the city center, heading straight for the manager's house. When I got there, the place was quiet. No one seemed to be home, so I waited in my car, watching the street. After a few minutes, the manager rounded the corner, parking his car in the driveway. I waited until he got out, and then quietly followed him up the path to his front door. Before he could even realize what was happening, I had him under control and strapped to a chair in his living room. The fear in his eyes said it all. "Who am I?" I growled, leaning close. He shook slightly, trying to play dumb. "What?" I roared into his ear. "Who the hell am I?" Emily's husband, he squeaked. Speak up, soldier. Who am I? Emily's husband, he cried, his voice breaking as tears started to flow. I didn't know, man, I swear. If I'd known, I never would have done it. Done what? I barked. Fuck Emily, he blurted, sobbing like a child. I'm so sorry. Pathetic. The only thing missing was him calling for his mommy. I stared at him for a moment, then leaned back. I need compensation. And here's what's going to happen. You'll never contact my wife again. You'll pack up and leave town within 24 hours. Do you understand me? Yes, I understand, he stammered. I have some cash and a collection of watches. You can take them. I smirked. Good. I'm going to cut you loose, and you're going to show me. One wrong move, one sound louder than a whisper, and I'll make sure you regret it. The tone of my voice did the trick. It always did. He led me upstairs to the same room where I'd hidden the night before. There, he opened a closet to reveal a large vault. Without hesitation, he spun the dial and opened it. Inside was a treasure trove, 12 high-end watches, several kilos of gold bars, stacks of cash and dollars, and even some loose diamonds. He grabbed a backpack and began filling it, his hands shaking as he stuffed the items inside. Once the bag was full, barely zipping shut, I marched him outside, still keeping him under control. He loaded the backpack into the back seat of my car, and I locked the doors. The man stood there, trembling, as I got in and drove away. After leaving the manager's house, I turned onto a north-northeast route and drove for about 45 minutes. I parked at the best sushi restaurant in the region, a place run by the family of one of my army buddies. It's a spot where I'm always welcome, and I knew I'd get a good meal and a clear head. The moment I walked in, I was greeted warmly by my friend's younger sister. She smiled brightly, kissed me on both cheeks, and then surprised me with a kiss on the mouth. That's how close we all are. She took my drink order, and, within minutes, my buddy appeared from the kitchen. We hugged, greeted each other like the old friends we were, and sat down at my favorite table. I started telling him everything that had been going on at home. Every betrayal, every decision, and every action I had planned to take in the coming days. What started as lunch turned into a 3-hour dinner, far too long for a simple midday meal. But it was necessary. We talked everything through, from the events of the past few months to how I planned to respond moving forward. By the time I left, I felt calmer, more focused. When I got home, the house was empty. The strumpet, my wife, was gone. Good for her. It was the right choice. That's when I remembered the backpack sitting in the back seat of my car. I hadn't even thought about it during the drive back. I went outside, unlocked the car, and there it was untouched. If some random thief had stumbled across it, he'd have hit the jackpot of a lifetime. But, for once, luck was on my side. I grinned as I brought it inside. When I opened it up, I nearly fell over in shock. Inside was a treasure worth $2.5 million, gold, diamonds, bonds, and stacks of cash. I stared at it, almost unable to believe what I was holding. That's when my phone rang. It was her. I ignored it. The phone rang again a moment later, and this time, her father's number appeared on the screen. I answered. "Are you home?" he asked. "I'll come by." She forgot something. When he arrived, we sat down, and I laid everything out for him. We talked for another 2 hours. By the end of it, I handed him all the bonds and shares I'd found, worth $500,000. "Use this to strengthen your pension," I told him. He looked at me with gratitude and said, "Thank you." But even he knew this wasn't over yet. In the weeks that followed, I learned something infuriating. Despite my explicit orders to stay away from each other, my wife and her manager had been in contact. That's why I tracked him down again within 24 hours. This time, he never saw me coming. When he woke up, it wasn't in our town. Hell, it wasn't even in our country. He came to weeks later in a hospital far, far away, a place where he had no phone, no passport, and no money to his name. The local language was foreign to him, and no one he encountered spoke his tongue. Or perhaps they simply chose not to. Once he recovered enough to be released, they transferred him to a psychiatric institute specializing in severe mental health issues. No one knew where he'd come from. No one recognized him. On paper, he was just another John Doe, Of course, my ex-wife at this point, suspected I had something to do with his disappearance. She even filed a missing persons report, which sparked an investigation. Just before the police came to question me, they visited the factory where she worked. Her colleagues gave them the same story. The manager had left town voluntarily after having a conversation with me. The two officers assigned to the case spoke to me, but found no evidence tying me to his disappearance. They were left empty-handed, and eventually, the manager's face and data ended up on the Interpol website. But no one ever connected him to the broken man labeled John Doe in that psychiatric hospital. As for my wife, her betrayal cost her everything. She was outcast at work. Everyone there knew what she'd done. People in town avoided her, unwilling to be seen near her. Within a few months, she resigned from her job and left town. She only returned occasionally to visit her parents. A year later, everything had changed for me. I bought a beautiful villa on the edge of town with a view that stretched out over the lake. My life had started over. I was in a new relationship, one that brought me peace and purpose. My girlfriend was 15 years younger than me, and within a few years, she gave me 2 strong sons and a beautiful little girl. She's my princess, daddy's girl through and through. And here's the kicker. My new soon-to-be wife wouldn't dare betray me. She's a Special Forces veteran herself, the first woman in our country to complete that level of training. So yes, you could say we lived happily ever after.